Excellent. Land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Lasonic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, of course, when this was created, we were having our regular meetings at the University of Victoria. The land acknowledgement still applies, but do watch for some breaking news. We think that we've found a lovely place to meet in person once again. We'll be announcing that soon. The Victoria Natural History Society has been around a long time and continues to grow and change. Membership continues to grow, and we are offering many diverse presentations and field trips and really fascinating things to be a part of. To find out more, our website is listed here, and I'd encourage you to check it out. It's a pretty amazing organization. We encourage membership in VNHS because what we use the membership money for is, as you see here, interpretive signage and displays around Victoria and scholarships and bursaries that have had quite an impact. We get excited when we hear from some of the recipients of these in years past and what they have moved forward with in their careers. So it really does make a difference if you are a member of VNHS. You can register through our online form or download the membership form and mail it in. And the categories are here, 30 individual, 35 family. But do reach out if you have questions about that. We're happy to help. Included in your membership is the subscription to the Naturalist magazine and also to BC Nature, the provincial organization. Their last issue just dropped and it was one of the best I've ever seen. So it really does give you an insight into what's going on provincially. That's a lovely perk of membership with VNHS. Now, meet Jenny. Jenny is a keen naturalist, Jenny Feick. Her last name rhymes with hike. And Jenny, that's an excellent way to remember your name because clearly that's a big part of your life. Jenny has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology, a minor in Physical Geography, and a Master's in Environmental Science, and a PhD, my goodness, in Natural Resource Geography, all from the University of Calgary. During her 25-year coast-to-coast career with Parks Canada, she's worked as a park naturalist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Waterton Parks, and Kootenay National Parks, and then other positions in planning, research, and management in Western and Atlantic regions. From 2000 to 2012, Jenny managed various programs for the BC Ministry of Environment, including habitat protection, terrestrial ecosystem science, stewardship outreach, climate change adaptation for nature, and environmental policy. Jenny retired in 2012. What an amazing career, Jenny. The next slide shows her out being active. Jenny served on the board of the Friends of Ecological Reserves from 2011 to 2021, when she and her husband, Ian Hatter, moved to Invermere in the headwaters of the Columbia River. Jenny volunteers for BC Parks as the warden for Mount Sabine Ecological Reserve and assists her husband, Ian Hatter, who's the volunteer warden for Columbia Lake Ecological Reserves. Both Jenny and Ian are still members of the Victoria Natural History Society. Thanks, Jenny. And so with that, Jenny, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you to be host and share some of your slides. We're really looking forward to what you have to share tonight.
Okay, thanks so much, Galia. I really appreciate that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on Zoom to explore the hidden gems of British Columbia's protected area system, the ecological reserves. So in the next, it's not advancing. Okay, just a second here. There we go, perfect. In the next 50 minutes or so, 45, 50 minutes, I'll tell you about BC's ecological reserves, or ERs, what they are, their origins, a bit about the history of ERs in BC. I'll tell you how many ERs there are in British Columbia and show you where they are located. And I'll go into a bit more detail about the 2 ERs for which Ian Hatter and I are volunteer wardens. I'll then outline who takes care of ecological reserves, the agency with the management responsibility for existing ERs, the volunteer ER wardens, and the not-for-profit group that advocates on their behalf. I'll describe the challenges that ERs face today, in particular the 2 in the Columbia River headwaters near where we live. And I'll conclude with some musings about the future of ERs in British Columbia. So in my opinion, the hidden gems of BC's protected areas system are its ecological reserves, which are set aside for scientific study and education, not recreation. Each ER was established to represent a particular ecosystem type within the biogeoclimatic ecological classification, or BEC system of BC. Certain ERs also protect rare species or other significant biological phenomena, or some even protect special geological features. And a few protect culturally significant areas. Ecological reserves, as I mentioned, are part of our provincial protected areas system, and all usually small in size. BC's ERs are distributed across most of the different ecosystems in the province. This map shows the protected areas in BC, including the location and number of each ecological reserve. And the map was produced and distributed by the Friends of Ecological Reserves. And I'll show you this map again later on. So the origin of ecological reserves in BC stems from this man, a Czech refugee fleeing the communists in 1949. Vladimir Krajina, the man who became the so-called father of BC's ecological reserve system, was born in January 1905 in what is now the Czech Republic. Persecuted by both the far-right fascist Nazis during World War II and then later the extreme left-wing communists afterwards, Dr. Krajina and his wife and family fled to Canada in 1949. The University of British Columbia had offered this professor of botany at Charles University in Prague a 2-year position as a special lecturer in the UBC Department of Botany. This was his ticket to freedom. And that initial appointment in 1949 kicked off Krajina's 24 years of teaching plant ecology at UBC. In 1958, he was made full professor. While at UBC, Dr. Krajina and his graduate students developed the BEC system that I mentioned earlier. Dr. Krajina then came up with the idea of setting aside special areas to represent all the different categories within that ecological classification system for scientific research and educational purposes. Starting in the 1950s, amid a logging boom, Krajina advocated protecting BC's diverse natural ecological gene pool in what he called at first nature museum sites. He lobbied the BC government to legally protect a whole system of such areas distinct from the provincial parks. Krajina successfully used his considerable expertise and charisma in a campaign to establish this new type of protected area, one devoted to biodiversity conservation, scientific study, and monitoring environmental change, something he came to call the ecological reserve. By the late 1960s, he proposed that 1% of the provincial crown lands in British Columbia be set aside for scientific and study and education in these ecological reserves. On November 25th, 1965, Krajina, an official from the Provincial Museum, and other academics met with this man, Ray Williston. He was then the so-called Minister of Lands, Forests, and Water Resources. and they convinced him that creating such reserves would support Canada's upcoming centennial and its commitment to participate in the International Biological Program, the first global effort to coordinate large-scale environmental and ecological studies. Encouraged by Kraina and other scientists, Ray Williston and William Kiernan, who was then the Minister of Recreation and Conservation, agreed in 1968 to form an ecological reserve committee to advise government on the selection of potential reserves, or at least the potential sites for them. Kraina served as the co-chair of this scientific board. In the provincial legislature in 1969, Minister Williston declared that these proposed reserves would represent, or quote, represent specific examples of biogeoclimatic zones of the province. Their reservation will ensure that the present and future requirements of ecologists for biological study will be satisfied for all time, end of quote. Ray Williston, Minister of Forests, Lands, and Water Resources of the Socred government, formally introduced the concept of ecological reserves on January 27, 1971. He credited Dr. Vladimir Kraina with the extensive studies to support the selection of locations for all of these reserves. Then on March 17, 1971, he introduced the bill that led to the Ecological Reserves Act into the BC legislature. The Ecological Reserves Bill went to second reading, where it was supported and strengthened by the NDP opposition. Here is one of the quotes about the bill from that day, right out of Hansard. And the BC legislature passed the bill unanimously. On April 2nd, 1971, the Ecological Reserve Act received royal assent and became law. BC thus became the first jurisdiction in Canada and the world to establish and protect ecological reserves. On May 4th, 1971, the first order in council under the Ecological Reserve Act established the initial 29 ecological reserves in BC. And here is the list. Many of them protected seabird islands off the coast of British Columbia. 3 ERs in the East Kootenays, where I now live, are on this list. Number 19, Mount Sabine. Number 20, Columbia Lake, and Ram Creek Hot Springs. Number 26 are all in bold there. I'll say more on those later on in the talk. And pictured here behind this list is Lasqueti Island Ecological Reserve number 4, set aside to protect the natural environment representative of the dry southern coastal forests, specifically the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic subzone, which has less than 2.5% of its area protected provincially. Minister Ray Williston set a goal in 1971 to establish 100 ecological reserves over the next decade. In the first few years, Dr. Kraina and his colleagues provided the scientific advice to inform the BC government on where ERs should be established. There was so much work involved in those early days to conduct all of the scientific and technical work needed to set up and manage the reserves that a small program within the BC government was developed. Bristol Foster, pictured here with his staff, removing the invasive alien shrub Scotch broom from Griffin Island in Oak Bay Islands ER, headed up the Ecological Reserves program from 1974 to 1984. During his time as director, 80% of the ERs now in British Columbia were established. The program produced a guide to ecological reserves in British Columbia and a regular newsletter. Louise Goulet was the next director, starting in 1985. Under Premier Bennett, she had to oversee the dismantling of the Ecological Reserves program. In 1985-86, Premier Bennett disbanded the ER committee, the group of independent scientists advising the government on which candidate sites should become ERs. He placed responsibility for ERs with BC Parks. And then in 1991, BC Parks was decentralized, and they cut the ER program at headquarters, and everything just went to the regions. As you can see from this slide, the Ecological Reserves program got off to a great start with 101 reserves established in the first decade. So Minister Ray Williston's goal was realized. 29 were created in the following decade, and only 20 more ERs were set up in the 1990s. After Premier Gordon Campbell was elected in the early 2000s, he gave away 6 of the reserves to other government agencies in order to save a minuscule amount of funds involved in their management. Only 4 ecological reserves have been designated since 2001. BC now has a total of 148 ERs. As I mentioned, after Premier Gordon Campbell came to power in 2001, the BC government sought to rid itself of not only ecological reserves, but a number of provincial parks and other protected areas as well, because they were seen as a cost, not an investment. This unofficial policy was eventually rescinded after quite a bit of public protest, but not before 6 ERs were transferred to other land management agencies. Under Premier Campbell's new era of governance, the previous model of land use planning and consultation related to land use planning ceased. The power to establish new protected areas on Crown lands was taken away from BC Parks. The provincial government established very few protected areas and even fewer ecological reserves. The last ER designated in BC was Detsan, the Wet'suwet'en name for juniper. And this ER protects rare, old growth juniper forests near Smithers. BC Parks purchased this 5.8 hectare site from a private landowner in the fall of 2009. And since then, despite changes in government, no progress has been made to designate any new ecological reserves. So where are these ERs? So here's that map again. And it shows the protected areas in BC and the location and the number of all of the 148 ERs. In terms of which region in the province the ERs are concentrated, 16% are in the Skeena region, and nearly 1/3 are on the West Coast. And by West Coast, the West Coast region of BC Parks includes Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii. There's actually 28 ecological reserves just in southern Vancouver Island. There used to be 30, but 2 were given away when Gulf Islands National Park was established. So they're now part of that national park. So the Kootenay boundary region, where I live now, has 11 ERs, or 7% of the ecological reserves in the whole province. And this represents 4% of the area occupied by ERs in BC. Nearly half of the area occupied by ERs in BC is in the Skeena region, indicating that the size of the ERs there tends to be larger than in the other regions. And as an example, ER number 68, Gladys Lake, within the Spatsizi Plateau Wilderness Provincial Park, which is 44,098 hectares in area, it remains the largest ER in BC. And it protects alpine and subalpine habitat for stone sheep, mountain goat, and woodland caribou. This is the list of the 11 ERs in the Kootenay boundary region. And this picture was taken in ER 104, Gilnockie Creek, south of Cranbrook. And that's Wayne Stetsky, who's also online here, I see. And Wayne is the ER warden for that ER. And he's just on the right beside me. And then on the other side is my husband, Ian Hatter, who's the ER warden for Columbia Lake ER. A function of ERs is to safeguard representative samples of all of the variants and subvariants of the biogeoclimatic ecological classification system to provide opportunities for scientific study and education. They thus can provide a window into understanding the ecological relationships and changes in biodiversity resulting from climate change and other landscape level changes. In BC, ERs tend to be small. Nevertheless, they contribute to the system of protected areas used by wide-ranging species like birds, ungulates, and bears. Where Ian and I now live in the headwaters of the Columbia River, Mount Sabine ER and Columbia Lake ER form part of a network of protected areas along the east side of Columbia Lake that maintain a healthy watershed, provide habitat for wildlife, and facilitate wildlife movement. Mount Sabine, ER number 19, and Columbia Lake, ER number 20, were on the list of the first 29 ERs established by the Ecological Reserves Act First Order in Council, passed on May 6, 1971. So they are among the oldest ERs in BC, Canada, and, well, the world. And I'll tell you a bit more about each of these, starting off with the one that I'm the warden for, Mount Sabine. So Mount Sabine is in the forested area on top of Mount Sabine, but not the summit. It's perched above Columbia Lake near Canal Flats. And the altitude is around 1,400 meters above sea level. And Mount Sabine is interesting from the standpoint of geographically. It marks the southern extent of the Stanford Range, which is part of the western ranges of the Rocky Mountains. And this range extends north to Sinclair Creek near Radium Hot Springs. Situated to the northeast of Canal Flats on the southeast side of Columbia Lake, this tiny ER is just 7.9 hectares or 19.5 acres in size, and it is square in shape. The original proposal that was put forward by UBC botanist Dr. Jack Mays in the late 1960s, 1970, called for a much larger reserve, one of 20.23 hectares or 50 acres. And since September 12th, 1997, fortunately, it has been surrounded by the East Columbia Lake Wildlife Management Area, which acts as a bit of a buffer zone. This ER protects a forest site that is cooler and moister than that found in the adjacent dry Rocky Mountain Trench. Originally, it was set aside in 1971 to protect a sedge meadow encircled by a montane spruce forest, something very unique in that dry area. Over the past 5 decades, though, the climate overall has become warmer and more arid. So the site has offered an opportunity to monitor the effects that this has had on this particular ER's vegetation. The flora under the tree canopy typifies plants that can withstand shade or partial shade, including the Western rattlesnake plantain, an orchid, the shrub, the Utah honeysuckle, rufous milkcap, one of the many fungi, and a huge number of mosses, including this red-stemmed feather moss. This ER provides excellent woodpecker habitat and is well used by a variety of ungulates as well as black bear. Columbia Lake Ecological Reserve is situated on the flank of Mount Sabine, 150 meters above Columbia Lake, so not as high, and adjacent to the rough gravel road that goes to the towers that are visible on the hill above Columbia Lake. The Columbia Lake ER is located on the southeast side of Columbia Lake, north of Mount Sabine ER, and 5 kilometers north of Canal Flats. This is bigger than Mount Sabine. It's 29 hectares, and it's also surrounded by the East Columbia Lake Wildlife Management Area. And this wildlife management area is huge. It's 8,576 hectares in area. The Spirit Trail, which some of you may have heard of, it is an 8,000-year-old indigenous travel route along the east side of Columbia Lake, and it passes just below Columbia Lake ER. The Columbia Lake ER protects really significant hydrological and geological features, including incredible limestone cliffs, cold mineral springs, and these cold mineral springs produce tufa deposits. I have a picture or an actual example of tufa here, which came from just outside of the reserve. It's just light as a feather. And all of the associated vegetation around those cold mineral springs with the calcium-rich water, the tufa deposits, the limestone cliffs. And they call it calciocolous vegetation. So it has to have a lot of calcium carbonate to survive. In addition, Columbia Lake ER protects ecosystems representative of the interior Douglas fir forest. So of major significance here are these calcium carbonate loving plants, which grow in the wet sites by the mineral springs, as well as the ones that grow on the dry limestone cliffs. And the Douglas fir pine grass forest type covers almost all of the ER, with the exception of these little linear oases around the mineral springs and streams. And this is the only ecological reserve in the whole system that protects the East Kootenay Trench interior Douglas fir ecosystem type. 2 of the calcium-loving plants for which this ER was established appear here. The Fee's lip fern, which is found on the dry limestone cliffs, and giant helleborine or stream orchid, which is found near the wet mineral springs. In addition, this ER also protects 2 significant populations of the endangered limber pine, which also grows on the limestone cliffs. Ian and I help BC Parks monitor 2 species, the stream orchid or giant helleborine, and the endangered limber pine, which 139 individuals at last count. So far, we have identified 10 different mammal species, 27 bird species, and 11 arthropod species in the Columbia Lake ER. We have frequently seen bighorn sheep and mule deer just outside the ER, and then found evidence of them, their scat and bones and tracks within the ER. We've seen a red fox running into the ER. We discovered a pack rat den. There's just and lots of red squirrels, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting to as a warden to get to know an area so deeply. One of our big thrills was this past summer when we were on exploring the area on top of the cliffs. And we found a common nighthawk's nest. They don't really build a nest. They just sort of put the eggs on the dry, hard ground. And the parent bird just had flushed off as we walked near. And so we quickly took a picture of the eggs and then headed out so she could return to the nest. In addition, we've seen a lot of butterfly species, and dragonflies, and also we're seeing quite a few spiders. And if anybody's interested, we do have species lists that we've been developing, and they're actually posted on the Friends of Ecological Reserves website, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. But I can go over the numbers of the different species in the different categories if anyone's interested at the end. Okay, so who cares for ecological reserves? So the management authority, and it's been the management authority for ecological reserves since 1985, is BC Parks. And currently they are responsible for the management and the stewardship of all 148 of the existing ERs that remain within the protected area system. BC Park Rangers have the authority to enforce the Ecological Reserve Act and its regulations within existing ERs. For years, charging violators was nearly impossible for rangers to do due to the wording of the regulations, the lack of clarity on the boundaries of some of its reserves, the limited number of rangers that BC Parks has, and the low priority BC Parks had to place on ERs because of the demands from all of its busiest provincial parks. And BC Parks has been working to address those particular issues, but that was the situation for several decades. BC Parks has a modest budget to purchase private land from willing buyers who would like to see their property protected from development, either through designating it as a provincial park or an ecological reserve. And several ecological reserves have been created in this way. The agency currently responsible for land use planning, though, it's not BC Parks, it's the Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. And that's the ministry that has the authority to add any new protected areas on Crown land, including any new ecological reserves. And while we have seen land added to a few provincial parks, including very recently, no new ERs have been designated. As part of its stewardship role for existing ERs, BC Parks has installed signs on the boundaries of some of its ecological reserves to identify the borders of the reserves, their protected status, and authorized and prohibited uses. And now to the wardens. BC Parks initiated the volunteer ecological warden program in 1980. ER wardens support BC Park staff with a great variety of tasks, including invasive plant control, inventory of flora and fauna, identification of management issues and threats to the ER, and communication with the public about ERs. These dedicated volunteers serve a vital role in the long-term protection of BC's ecological reserves. Ecological reserve wardens are the eyes and ears of BC Parks in the province's ERs. I'm the ER warden for ER number 19, Mount Sabine, and my husband Ian Hatter is the ER warden for ER number 20, Columbia Lake. So far at Mount Sabine ER, we, along with other biologists, including Wayne Stetsky's here online. I don't know whether Ian Adams or Trevor Kinley is here, but we've tried to pinpoint the unsigned location of Mount Sabine. Mount Sabine does not have any signs around it at all. We have tried to walk the perimeter, and then we have also explored inside the ER to try, unsuccessfully so far, to find the sedge meadow and the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir birch forest for which the ER was established. In addition, we have been photographing and identifying flora and fauna and posting to iNaturalist and developing species lists. At the Columbia Lake ER, our primary activities involve monitoring the string orchid and the limber pine populations making other natural history observations to inform the development of species lists, and removing alien invasive species and litter from the ER. Ian and I both developed an annual report for BC Parks for each ER, which includes recommendations on management actions, and our reports for the past 2 years are posted on the Friends of Ecological Reserves website. And that's where the species lists are contained. They're a work in progress. These reports contain maps and statistics for all of the iNaturalist observations that have been made in the 2 ERs, not just by us, but also by other observers. The Friends of Ecological Reserves, or FAIR, is a volunteer-based, not-for-profit charitable organization. FAIR promotes the interests of the ecological reserve system in British Columbia and raises public awareness of the ecological reserves program. And FAIR arose in 1983 in response to the cuts to the BC government ER program. FAIR provides some support to researchers in and around ecological reserves. It prepares and circulates a regular newsletter called The Log. It supports ER wardens and the warden function within ecological reserves, and it educates the public within BC regarding the important features of ERs, including biodiversity conservation. In 2020, FAIR brought to the attention of the BC government the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Ecological Reserves Act. And as a result, in 2021, the BC government issued a proclamation declaring April 2nd as Ecological Reserves Day. And BC Parks created a commemorative poster. FAIR also provided numerous articles, including several for the Victoria Naturalist. They updated their website content to document the history of ecological reserves in BC. And FAIR offered several online events during that pandemic year to commemorate the passage of the Ecological Reserves Act 50 years prior. One of the most interesting 50th anniversary projects was proposed by a high school student at one of FAIR's events. This student, Jamie Frith, with the help of the Friends and permission from BC Parks, developed a documentary film using drone and macro footage of the amazing large and small scale features of 6 of the ERs on Vancouver Island. He also interviewed the ER warden for each of the 6 reserves. And if it were not for the pandemic travel restrictions, Jamie would have included ERs in other regions of the province. And if you have not watched this wonderful creation that Jamie made, go onto the Friends website and just type in the title there, zoom in, zoom out, and you will get it. And it's really worth watching. Existing ERs face numerous challenges. In a report I wrote for the Friends in 2020 and updated in 2021, I summarized the challenges that BC Parks and ER wardens have documented in BC's ecological reserves. The top 5 are a variety of internal threats, then external threats followed, limited information, boundary issues, and alien species. So those were the top 5. They were followed fairly closely by First Nations issues and climate change. Limited resources and policy problems were occasionally mentioned. The issue most often identified was the presence of threats inside the ERs themselves, including inappropriate activities, such as recreational use, illegal camping in the ER, as well as hunting, trapping, cattle grazing, physical trespass, and vandalism. So the next most often mentioned issue was external threats to the ERs. And numerous ERs are now tiny fragments of nature surrounded by human development. And that development also poses threats to the ER. Here are just a few examples of the threats to ERs. So a blob of oil that washed up on the Oak Bay Islets ER from a Juan de Fuca Strait. A fallen down fence, originally installed by BC Parks, but not maintained, that now allows feral livestock and dogs to enter the Mount Maxwell ER. And the dogs are chasing the native wildlife, and the sheep are destroying the native vegetation and introducing a lot of alien species into the reserve. And then this one was rather interesting. After Big White Ski Resort started building runs into the Big White Ecological Reserve, it was discovered that the survey conducted by BC Parks to delineate the ER boundaries was incorrect. And so a section was cut out of the ER and given to the ski resort. So in the Kootenay boundary region, the pattern of challenges is a little different. While internal threats are still the most frequently mentioned issue, the next most often mentioned concerns are the lack of baseline information about these ERs. And back when I did the report, the lack of ER wardens. But since this report was submitted to BC Parks, they made efforts to address the ER warden vacancies. And now all of the ERs in the East Kootenays have ER wardens. In the two ERs in the headwaters of the Columbia River, we noted three main issues. First, in Mount Sabine ER, none of the boundaries are marked. And so it is difficult to tell when one is in the ER or not. Information varies depending on which GPS system one uses. And as a result, there is evidence of previous timber cruising inside the ER boundaries. Past logging went right up to what the timber companies thought were the ER boundaries, but actually turned out to be inside the reserve. Access is also an issue with Mount Sabine ER. An access road to a major climbing area, the Asmanoff Cliffs, was built right through this tiny reserve. Also, government signs that are supposed to tell people where the reserve is, they're currently located in the wrong place. The access road is really rough. You have to have, well, up until now, you had to have a four-wheel drive high clearance vehicle. Our Subaru Forester is completely inadequate to get there. And the road has now deteriorated to the point where we need to find a friend who has a quad. The third major issue with Mount Sabine is that climate change and adjacent logging have altered the microclimate of this tiny ER, making it more arid and hot in summer. And as a result, many of the Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir have died or are dying. Western larch and Douglas fir are becoming the dominant tree species now. The ER was set aside to protect a sedge meadow and a montane spruce ecosystem, but this ecosystem is changing, has changed. Some in BC Parks have suggested getting rid of this ER. Others see the site as an important place to study the effects of climate change. While the lower boundary of the Columbia Lake ER that is adjacent to the access road is clearly marked, no signs or markers exist on the upper boundary. So this makes it difficult to know when one is in the ER in that particular area. It's very clear when you're near the access road, it's just not clear up above. And while the lower part of the ER is easily accessible from a good gravel road, the upper reaches of the ER require a high clearance four-wheel drive vehicle. And judging by the tracks, it looks like a trail biker has repeatedly visited parts of the ER, so they can still access even inside the ER where there's no trail. And due to the lack of signs on the upper boundary, that particular individual may not have even known he was trespassing on an ecological reserve. Due to the difficult access and the lack of official trails, though, human use is still pretty low in that particular ER. Dirt bikes have caused erosion and allowed several alien species to invade. And you can see my arrow here. These are trail bike tracks. We're just following this route, which went straight up this hill. And the only place that we found dandelions in the entire reserve was all along this guy's trail bike track. In addition, people have thrown beverage containers and other litter into the ER from the access road in several places. And there's some evidence that people have been camping or at least having campfires in the upper area of the ER. In terms of the future of ecological reserves in British Columbia, one encouraging action taken by BC Parks in 2022 was an update of the ecological reserve regulations to make them easier to enforce. Less encouraging is the lack of progress made to complete the ER system. Since 2014, the Friends of Ecological Reserves has brought a list of 7 candidate sites to the attention of the BC government. These include Pink Mountain, which is an alpine area near Fort St. John that contains the greatest concentration of rare and endangered alpine plants anywhere in British Columbia. When Feick met with the BC government before 2021, the officials said that BC had already overachieved its original 12% protected areas target. So there are new federal targets now for 25% protected areas by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And so Feick hopes that Dr. Vladimir Krajina's dream that 1% of the Crown land in British Columbia could someday be protected by ecological reserves. The 148 ecological reserves that currently occupy only 0.13% of BC's Crown land base. And that means to reach Krajina's dream, we still would need another 0.87 of Crown land to be set aside in ecological reserves. That's a 7-fold increase. And it's another 774,888 hectares. Feick has been told that there are only 2 ways that the new protected areas, any new protected areas, not necessarily ecological reserves, will get added to the system. One is if there are political champions who are willing to take proposals for ERs to the BC legislature. In 2021, the 50th anniversary year, one MLA promoted the value of ecological reserves in the BC legislature, BC Liberal Jordan Sturdy. Here in the East Kootenays, Wayne Stetsky, who previously served as an MP and as mayor of Cranbrook and is now a city councillor in Cranbrook, volunteers as an ER warden at the Gilnockie Creek ER near Moy. Wayne is also on the board of the Elders Council for Parks in BC and has met with the BC government to discuss establishing more protected areas, including ERs. The other and perhaps more likely way that protected areas are being established in BC is if the proposal assists in meeting the government's goals for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Several Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, have been established in the last few years. And the Ecological Reserves Act allows for use by Indigenous peoples. ERs could be used as a tool to safeguard areas that are important to Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge keepers. You can help safeguard British Columbia's ecological reserves by, number one, contacting your MLA, the Ministers of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, George Heyman, and Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, Nathan Cullen, to express support for the expansion of the ER system to help meet the national goals for more protected areas, 25% by 2025, 30% by 2030. Number two, by joining the Friends of Ecological Reserves and other groups that support them, such as BC Nature and the Elders Council for Parks in British Columbia. Number three, if you happen to visit an ER, to obey the rules and regulations. And lastly, number four, you can apply to BC Parks to become an ER warden. And I just received an email today stating that BC Parks, instead of just having one warden per ecological reserve, is now more open to the idea of having multiple ER wardens for one particular reserve. Before I wrap up, I'd just like to thank all these individuals and organizations for their contributions of pictures, maps, tables, and historical information that informed this presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenny. Wow. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? Please.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks again for coming out. And does anyone have any questions?
I'm hoping people will drop their questions into the chat or come off video so we can see you. There was one put in the chat, which was a question about mountain biking in reserves and how to deal with that.
Okay. I'm trying to open up the chat here. Okay. I have not seen that. When I did that report back in 2020 and 2021, mountain biking was not mentioned very often, but it is not allowed. I think one place where I have where there was a threat of mountain biking was on Mount Sabine Ecological Reserve, and BC Parks has posted signs, they've put up fencing, and they have, I think they've managed it quite well in working with adjacent land management agencies in terms of directing mountain bikes away from the area of Mount Sabine that has the ecological reserve and into other areas where they're allowed. If I'm not sure if the warden, ER warden, is here from Mount Sabine, Genevieve Singleton. She was going to join if she could tonight, but she may have some more up-to-date information on that. But the last time I was there, which was this past May, early May, we didn't see any evidence of mountain bikes being in that particular reserve. And yes, are there publications of scientific contributions of ERs over the decades? Yes. And they are posted on the Friends of Ecological Reserves website. And they are listed, any scientific publication associated with a particular reserve is located with all the other information about a reserve. So you can search reserves by their number or by their name, and then you'll get a whole host of information, including scientific publications. Okay, we've got lots and lots of questions here.
Are you okay, Jenny, to see them and reply?
Yeah, I'm just kind of going to scroll up, make sure I haven't missed anything here. Registration problem, any problem with mountain bikes? Okay, publications. What do you see as the best way to raise the profile and importance of ERs within current and future provincial governments? And the focus on climate change sites devoted to ecological monitoring. So yeah, they should be. Well, I think I would like to ask Wayne if he's willing to talk to us about what he has been doing, because he's been a real champion for ecological reserves and protected areas in general, and has a lot of insight into how government works and what would be an effective way forward. Wayne, are you willing to say a few words?
Thanks, Jenny. Great presentation as always. One of the things that I think is important, I just put it in the chat actually, is that every year an all-party financial committee goes around the province and anyone can sign up to meet with them. It includes MLAs from all the different parties and it's working towards forming the budget for the following year. And so anyone can sign up to present and to talk about issues that are important to them. And I think if there was a focused effort and they heard the words ecological reserves from a number of different parts of the province as they travel the province, that might put a spotlight on ecological reserves that has not been there for quite a while. And last year, when I presented to the committee on behalf of the Elders Council for Parks in BC, you're only supposed to have three things that you focus on. And so I focused on 30 by 30. And of course, that the government's made it very clear that getting to 30 by 30 will be Indigenous led all the way through so far. I asked them to increase BC Parks budget to $100 million a year. And asked them for more money for the planning tables because protected areas of all kinds eventually come out of these planning tables. They call it modernized land use planning. But I also snuck in ecological reserves in terms of the presentation. Now they kind of cut you off after three things, but I think it would be really valuable to have organizations like natural history societies around the province appear at these tables and include ecological reserves and the need to both adequately fund them and also expand them to potentially reach the 1% that was the initial target. So the more voices we have speaking to ecological reserves, the more opportunity there will be for a focus on it by government going into the future. And Jenny's absolutely right. There's been no focus, certainly on the system, ecological reserve system, for at least a decade in government. So one way to do it, put it on your list of things to do, everyone who's attending today. And there's quite a few people here, but think about that. It's, you just sign up and they give you a time and a location, and then you get to present.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting when you look at other jurisdictions. I did another report for the Friends and BC Parks on what are other jurisdictions in Canada doing about ecological reserves. And Manitoba seems to really be doing well, and they're using ecological reserves as a means to achieve their conservation targets. And they're working very collaboratively with First Nations and establishing quite large ecological reserves, and they are being managed by elders, Indigenous elders, and they are protecting areas that are incredibly important to traditional ecological knowledge keepers. So I think we can learn a lot from what Manitoba is doing.
I'll just add to that quickly as well, Jenny, that when I met with the three ministers last year to talk about protected areas and conservation areas. Well, I asked them, so how can the Elders Council for BC Parks help you reach 30 by 30? And their answer was try and work through your local Indigenous groups, through your local bands. If you know an important area near you and you already have or can develop relationships with your local First Nations, and get it on their agenda, that is absolutely the best way then to see progress around protecting the land and water heading into at least the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things with the Pink Mountain proposal. They have a lot of support from local Indigenous people for that proposal. So it went forward into the land use planning process around Fort St. John, but I'm not sure where it stands at this point. Meanwhile, development has continued to occur in the area. So time is of the essence in protecting those rare and endangered alpine plants. There's a question about, would you tell us which ERs are near Victoria, please? And all I can remember is that there are 28 that are in southern Vancouver Island. There were 30. And I know there's one at 10 Mile Point. There is a table in an article that I wrote that, let's see, I could put my email down here in the chat, and if you want to email me, I can give you. I have a copy of the article, and it has the table in it, and that lists all of the reserves in that area. With that, hopefully, that would be helpful. Because there's 28, I don't want to sit here and just go through and list them all.
Jenny, I'm also going to just drop the website in, the Eco Reserves website,
Yes.
just to make sure everyone has it, because there's a wonderful handbook on how to become a steward or warden.
Yeah.
And some further information there. So
that handbook is produced by BC Parks. They put a lot of effort into that, and they did a really good job. Another comment here, we should give thanks to Jim Pojar and Hans Romer, and I totally agree. They were part of the program, and I had both of them down there on my list of acknowledgements because I consult with them regularly, and it was Jim who put me in touch with Dr. Mays, who was the original guy to put in the proposal for Mount Sabine Ecological Reserve all those years ago. And Hans was very helpful as well in explaining the history of how a scientist would come forward with a proposal. Here's the rationale, here's the area, here's the map. And then in the negotiations around cabinet, the reserve would get whittled down into whatever area was not deemed to be as valuable economically to the various interests. And so, because we were just trying to understand, why is Mount Sabine square? It doesn't really make sense from an ecological point of view. And why can't we find the sedge meadow? And why is it so small? It just seems so bizarre. But anyway, so Hans and Jim were fantastic in terms of providing information and insight on that as well. And Louise Goulet as well. So, and Bristol. So we're still in touch with all these people, and as are the Friends of Ecological Reserves, the people on the board. They were our mentors for sure. There was a question on, what do you think of the framework on biodiversity and ecosystem health initiative? And I have to apologize, but I have not seen that. So I don't know, Wayne, you may be more up on it than I am, but or you can maybe elaborate, Thorsten.
I know that's part of the suite of things coming forward as part of the nature agreement. I haven't looked at it in detail either, but I will just quickly say my discussions with some of the ADMs, there are 60 indigenous protected and conserved areas already in the queue from around the province. They're supposed to start rolling out here in January, and they're supposed to provide an opportunity for some public comment on them as well as they roll out. So something to watch for in your neighborhood. It's supposed to start rolling out now in January.
Given the apparent acceleration of climate change globally and locally, do we have time to make the necessary changes? Changes for, I'm not sure which changes you're talking about. Maybe just add a tiny bit. It's a bigger question if you're talking about changes to reverse biodiversity loss and that kind of thing. But if there's something specific with regards to ecological reserves. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I have ordered this book and I have ordered it twice and I still don't have it, but this book, Jan Drabek's biography of Vladimir Krajina, is so exciting. It's just an amazing, amazing book. So, I mean, we have been talking about his role with ecological reserves, but he did so much more and was just the most amazing individual. And real inspiration. And I guess, you know, there's a lot of talk right now in terms of the refugees from Ukraine and other countries, Afghanistan, etc. And I think it's important to look back at this particular refugee made a huge positive difference when he came to Canada, and that potential is with anyone when they're given that ticket to freedom in order to come to Canada and make a new life. So it's just food for thought. Good. BC Nature is preparing a detailed response to the BC Biodiversity Framework draft. Excellent. So noon tomorrow is the information webinar. Okay, well, that would be good. Do you have a link for that you want to share with anyone, or?
I'll see if I can find it.
Great. Are Indigenous protected areas equivalent to ERs? Well, I guess that's an interesting question, isn't it? And does it matter what they're called? I guess if they are established as an ER and are part of the system, then they fall under the protection of the Ecological Reserve Act and regulations, and that's the highest form of protection within the protected areas system. And with Indigenous protected areas, I think it varies, you know, what you can do in Indigenous protected areas. I'm just thinking of the area near us with Jumbo. They don't really prohibit a lot of things, but they don't want overnight accommodation and a big ski area in the middle of this region, which was one of the reasons why it was set aside as a protected area, was to stop that particular type of development. But heli skiing can still go on, and people are, of course, welcome to go in there and hunt and fish and travel by foot. And I don't think too many people mountain bike up in that area. Is pretty rugged. But yeah, so it's a different, I think it would be different if it's specifically set up to protect areas of importance to traditional knowledge keepers. Then it would have an element that would be similar to ERs. So,
and Jenny, the province is looking at developing some new legislation under the Land Act specific to Indigenous protected and conserved areas, because really there's no legal definition of them currently, and they're not included as a legal entity under the Land Act. So that's one of the things they're looking at, is a new piece of legislation around IPCAs.
Yeah, that would be really important. And so they're not legally part of the protected areas system then yet.
Not yet. They can, they could include ecological reserve. They could include BC parks. They could include national parks inside a larger boundary. Those would almost be like zones inside it. Right. But in order to really make them work, they need their own piece of legislation that defines what they are.
Yeah. Good.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Not only was your information relevant and so helpful, but it's inspiring when we see so many helpful questions come in. Yeah. So, there's the information about the meeting tomorrow for everyone. Thanks, Peter. Okay, I'll send this recording out to everyone if you want to capture these dates from the recording and other information. But Jenny, thank you so much. I was hanging on every word tonight, and I just really appreciate that. I really appreciate somebody who can be so inspiring and knowledgeable.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I was
Okay.
supposed to give this talk for Wings Over the Rockies Nature Festival last May 11th, and I had to have surgery. And
Oh no.
my first surgery date was in April, so I thought, no problem. And then they had to postpone it to the very day and at the very time that I was giving the presentation. So so I never got to give it. So it's nice to be able to do it today. And Wayne was going to help me by doing the presentation for me, and then he got sick. And so yeah, the presentation never happened until tonight. So that's good. Thanks.
Oh, goodness. So I feel really lucky to have had you. And thank you also, Wayne, for your contributions. That was really helpful.
Thanks.
So we're signing off. Good night, everyone. And thanks again, Jenny.
Okay.
And everyone stay safe. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.